Good evening, everyone. This is so much fun. Two of my favorite people, one of them home in Virginia, one of them home in Wyoming. I'm here in my office in Scottsdale. The magic of Zoom. We were just bemoaning the fact that we weren't all together here in Scottsdale so we could have the after party. But I am going to raise a glass of my lovely South African rosé and toast you both in the spirit
Nice.
of thinking you would be here.
Here.
I have boring water.
Same. I'm hydrating.
Come on, guys, you've got no imagination here. It's late enough to be drinking. It's really painful when I do the British authors because it's like 8 or 9 in the evening and they're swilling away and I have like a cup of tea. It just feels like we're completely out of sync. But anyway, so Tasha Alexander, let me hold up a copy of her book because the actual signed books from both Tasha and Deanna are somewhere in transit to the Poison Pen, but not actually here. So Tasha's book, The Dark Heart of Florence, has a beautiful cover. I don't suppose anyone could ever resist the Ponte Vecchio, can they, when they're doing Florence? No.
I think it's required by law that if you write a book about Florence, that they have to have the Ponte Vecchio. Either that or Botticelli. So
I know it's like a saguaro if it's Phoenix, there's just no escaping it. I can't show you a picture, and it's too bad because the cover is beautiful, but Deanna can, of her new book because I had to read it as a printout. I don't have a lovely advanced reading copy. Show us your cover. It's just beautiful. There it is. And maybe Deanna, you could explain because the imagery is so interesting. Why do you have like a snowy Alp and a person in climbing gear?
Because we have a Victorian female mountaineer who is central to the plot of this one. And they gave me a beautiful cover as always, and they gave me the exact shade of blue that I asked for. Sometimes I get to make requests and they indulged me. They're very, very good to me. So I have my beautiful blue cover.
Why is the blue significant?
The blue actually came about because I am besotted with Mary Berry. I love Mary Berry and was watching one of her shows that's not Great British Baking Show. She went to do Country Houses of England, and she was cooking in Powderham Castle, and it's the seat of the Earls of Devon. And the staircase hall at Powderham Castle is painted a very distinctive shade of blue that's actually called Powderham Blue. When I'm watching this and I'm thinking, that would make the most gorgeous book cover ever. And so I made note of it and I sent the link to my editor to pass along to the art department. And this is Powderham Blue.
It's gorgeous, Lord. It's like,
and I think it's evocative of a wintry theme. So it worked out really, really well.
I loved your little mythical kingdom. I mean, I have been to, I'm trying to remember which of the tiny kingdoms is it that is adjacent to Switzerland and Austria. It's not Andorra because that's the one further south, but what's the little?
Well, it's, I took a little inspiration from Liechtenstein, a little inspiration from Luxembourg, and most of it is just completely fabricated. It's super fun to create your own country. I highly recommend it.
It actually is. No, I definitely agree. And as I've said to your publicist, I actually remember vividly The Prisoner of Zenda.
Yes.
Both editions, the one with Douglas Fairbanks in the late, 1930s or something. And then the remake was Stuart Granger and Deborah Carr and James Mason, who was always such an oily, but classic British villain. I mean, James Mason was truly wonderful. But I couldn't help but think of Rudolph Rassendyll and the whole.
Oh, yeah. I reread the book. When I was kind of getting into the headspace to do this, I was like, oh, we've got to have some Zenda vibes here, just because every one of my books has at least one small element of homage to something that I've loved. And if it kind of creates that for the reader, if like they'll recognize if they've read those same books, they get it, it'll click, and they love it, and it's like a special little in for them. And if people are not familiar, then they may go running out and buy it and kind of rediscover something that's been lost for a while, because I don't know if anybody's actually reading Prisoner of Zenda anymore.
Anthony Hope in 1890 something or other. However, Yeah, but when I wrote up your book, I did remind people of both movies and, and the past and suggested they watch
Love
it.
it.
So we'll come back to why The Prisoner of Cinda is working so well for Deanna. But Tasha, you've actually moved out of the Victorian era. Technically, now it's 1903. You're Edwardian.
Yeah, I never thought I never thought Victoria would die back, gosh, in 2003 when I was in a garret apartment in New Haven, Connecticut. I never thought Victoria would die, but she did. So we're fully Edwardian now, which, if you're a woman in Britain, didn't really make a whole lot of difference, but there we are.
Well, but it does make some difference politically because, part of what you're now looking at is the gradual recognition of Germany rising up as a real threat. Victoria is not there to control her grandson, if in fact she ever could. Certainly his mother, Victoria's eldest daughter, the Princess Royal, has had no luck with Willie trying to swat him down. But this reminds me a little bit of, I'm trying to remember the first really great espionage book, which is set in the Frisians, where it's the Irish author. I always do this. Patrick, you can fill me in on the chat thing. He's the author who was assassinated or who was executed by the Irish in 1919 for being a traitor. But he wrote this wonderful espionage story where they were just beginning to suspect that the German Navy was a threat. And so they're cruising around in the Frisian Islands to check in on that. So why would it be true that in Florence, the German occupation? There he is, Erskine Shoulders, The Riddle of the Sands. I just love this feature of Zoom. Whenever I flub up, after Patrick checks me notes and saves me from disaster. The Riddle of the Sands, honestly, it's a great story and it holds up today, but it's a very early recognition. I think it's 1905 that the German threat is coming before the British even began to think about it.
Yeah, well, once you hit the turn of the century and Victoria dies, there was something that was actually called spy fever that gripped Britain. And people truly believed there were some novels written, there was an endless litany of pieces in the Daily Mail, not too surprising, about how the German spies were everywhere in Britain, that each of them had picked out their little plot of land that they were going to live on in Britain after the Germans defeated Britain. Now, this is before anyone is thinking about World War I, but the British really took this to heart, and there was a real feeling in the empire that Germany was going to be a huge problem for British sovereignty.
So when you started out, did you really think about Colin as being a secret agent? I mean, obviously he wasn't in the first book because she's still, a widow, and it's a while before Colin really becomes an integral part of her life. But did you always envision him as kind of a secret agent?
I did. And, I think when you start, when you write your first book, you can't really think, oh, this will be this long running series, because that's just hubris and you're inviting disaster. But I always had in the back of my head that there was more to Colin than Emily could see initially. And even now, when they've been married, more than a decade, if you're married to a secret agent, you're never going to know everything. You can't know everything. So we get more pieces of what he does for the empire and for the crown, but Emily can't ever really know all of it, because that's how it works if you're married to a spy.
Yeah, well, it's almost like, the Official Secrets Act is involved here, even if it's informal. So Deanna, did you think about Veronica or her guy fulfilling the kind of plot that happens in this book, i.e. a mission for the crown as opposed to some other kind of murder mystery?
I think it's like Tasha says, you write the first book in the series and you never know exactly where things are going to take you. The most you can do is kind of set things up. And sometimes and I wonder if this is true for Tasha, because sometimes I go back and I'm astonished at things that I put into place that I can make use of that I wasn't necessarily mapping out, but they're really, really helpful later on. It did occur to me because of Veronica's connection with the royal family and the fact that she has this relationship with Special Branch, that she is a good person to send in for the odd chore that isn't appropriate for someone with official standing. She's a good person to kind of come in and fulfill a little bit of a fixer role from time to time when things are too delicate or too personal for somebody else to kind of get on board with. When you don't necessarily want a record of something being fixed, Veronica is your girl.
But this is, that's in that whole British tradition of sending in, right. I don't want, amateur is not the word I'm looking for, but non-professional people. I suppose part of it is because the upper class already had incomes of their own, or presumably had incomes of their own. So they didn't have to be like salaried government employees. They could be.
Oh, exactly. Plus there's very much, once you reach a certain level of society, there's this idea that, we're in this together. A gentleman's word is his bond. And you kind of, you can see each other across the crowded room and you know what that person's standards are, where they went to school, who their sisters are. And there's an element of trust there that you wouldn't necessarily extend to someone who's in a different class level unless you've gotten to know them really, really well. There's a shorthand, the way we do shorthand regionally, the British have tended to do it class-wise. So it just kind of makes sense that Veronica would slot in there and kind of be a person that they have come to rely on sort of against their will. Because her relationship with the royal family is a little precarious, to say the least.
Quite precarious, actually.
And you probably have to say that again because my internet was making you go.
Are we losing you? We might be.
Oh no, I can hear you now. Okay.
Okay.
I was going to say that you really have this tradition in Britain that goes back centuries of noblesse oblige. If you are in the upper class, you are supposed to be protecting crown and country. If you take James Bond, right? James Bond is a gentleman who is independently wealthy. He's so rich that he can afford to keep an RAF mechanic. This is in the books, obviously. He has an RAF mechanic on retainer so that he can, anytime he wants, drive his Bentley 90 miles an hour. So there's this idea that's really ingrained in the culture that if you are in the upper class and you have the means, that you do what the empire needs you to do. And that's how I've really always envisioned Colin, and that when Emily first meets him, she sees that he, as he likes to say to her, takes care of matters that require a modicum of discretion. But he's actually doing a lot more than that. But she can't see that right away. But you do have this wonderful tradition in the empire of people stepping up and doing what they think needs to be done. Now, we can debate today whether or not those were good things to be doing, but certainly at the time, everyone thought they were, or at least the British thought they were.
So in your case, since Colin and Emily have children, it's also handy that there's that whole tradition of governesses or tutors or private schools, because it'd be pretty hard for them to be floating around Florence doing what they're doing in this book if they were dragging the kids along.
Absolutely. And, anyone who's had small children knows that a governess would be extremely useful if you want to be zipping around the world, saving the crown. But also at that time, it would have been considered extremely weird if you were home paying attention to your children. That was that was not thought to be good for the children even. And in fact, Jenny Churchill got, who of course was American, she got lots of flack because she was way more involved with her children's lives, Winston and his brother, than what the British upper class thought was appropriate. We Americans are always coming on in and messing up what people think they should be doing.
So Deanna, I'm raising a delicate question, since Veronica has a pretty good sex life, and
She
before
does.
Stoker, she was clearly so.
Mhm.
What kind of contraception was available to the Victorian woman other than abstinence, which is clearly not what she's doing?
No, there were a number of barrier methods and prophylactics. You could use the rhythm method. You could chart your cycle. You could use, there were some basic spermicides that you could use. There were condoms have been around for a couple of 100 years before this. So there were lots of different things you could use. There were different preparations that you could insert. I'm trying really hard to be tactful here.
To be delicate, right? No, I get it.
Delicate. Yeah, there were, and the thing is, a lot of those family planning methods were actually advertised in newspapers. Even abortifacients were advertised in Victorian newspapers, but they were always advertised as preparations for ladies and medicines to bring on your courses. And so it was right there front and center in the newspaper. Hey, this will get rid of an unwanted pregnancy if you have one. But women who were in the know and who actually talked about these things would share knowledge and could prevent pregnancy. It's just that it was considered to be a not very ladylike thing to talk about. So it's not knowledge that was really shared and a lot of people discussed, but that's why you have in the middle classes, you tended to see much larger families, whereas in the upper classes, these are women who had access to information, they had the money to spend on these things, and so they tended to have fewer children because in some cases they were actually engaging in family planning. It was one of those things where you could, and it ran the spectrum. You could go to your wedding night having zero idea of what your husband actually had in his trousers, or you could be completely prepared and know exactly what was going to happen and just tell your husband, I'm not ready for children, so we're going to have separate bedrooms for a couple of years. There were a few notable brides who did that. And so that was another method that you could use if you were completely averse to the idea of having children. I know one of the things that Queen Victoria raged about when Vicky, the Princess Royal, married Frederick, is that she got pregnant immediately. And Victoria was absolutely livid because she herself had not enjoyed her pregnancies. She greatly deplored the fact that she got pregnant so quickly after marrying Albert. And she wanted Vicky and Frederick to have time together to kind of be as a couple, enjoy their marriage. And within just 2 months of marrying, young Vicky's pregnant, and was actually a little nervous to have to write and tell Queen Victoria, hey, mom, grandchild is on the way. So there were expectations in some quarters that you could put these things off if you wanted to. And the fact that Veronica is a natural historian, she's a scientist, she certainly understands as much as you could at the time of the biology. And I feel like Veronica is the sort of person who would have zero compunction about asking an experienced person who does this for a living, hey, how do you prevent those complications? Because a number of courtesans were extremely successful at avoiding pregnancy and did a very good job, made a very good living without any of those complications. So I feel like Veronica has had some conversations on her travels and learned a thing or two.
Tasha, what about, Emily and Colin have had the one set, but one has to assume that they too are not trekking around the world with her pregnant.
Oh, no, they are not. And, sometimes complications occur after a difficult birth that makes that no longer possible. And if one has had twins in the Victorian era, I don't think that's, a shocking development. So, yeah.
Right.
But
Well,
you know, certainly this was a thing that women dealt with, and not everyone was getting pregnant all the time. Although in the kind of the height of the Victorian era, half of middle class brides were pregnant when they got married. So there was also a certain degree of not being as concerned about sex before marriage as we would maybe like to think the Victorians were.
well, you both have couples with relationships that are certainly healthy. So I think that's part of the fun of reading them. I really do. But children issue comes up a lot when you have a woman as your lead character. So I just thought I'd bring it up. I was thinking, you know, abortifacient was actually a key element in Poldark, if you remember it, when not Demelza, but the woman that Poldark had been in love with forever, you know, decides to abort her baby and it ends up killing her. So it wasn't necessarily safe. Maybe people who lived in rural areas were more dependent upon, you know, the elderly lady in the hut with her basic remedies, and maybe the city people were more sophisticated. Anyway, let's talk about what actually happens in the book. So Deanna, you've created this wonderful kingdom called the Alpenwald, which I absolutely love. How does Stoker and Veronica get to the point where Veronica agrees to take a role that one would not expect her to be doing?
Well, you know, I had set up this organization called the Hippolyta Club, known colloquially as the Curiosity Club, and it is an organization for extraordinary women. And so it has botanists and other scientists. It's got poets and mathematicians and musicians and painters and women of all kinds of exceptional abilities. And one of the members was a Victorian mountaineer who has, according to what Stoker deduces really early on, been murdered in the course of her latest expedition. And so it happened to be in my fictitious Alpenwald. And so that leads to complications from the Alpenwalders themselves, including their hereditary princess, who is their head of state, who bears a striking resemblance to Veronica, and that leads them into some complications that gives Veronica an opportunity to see what life might have been like if she had been recognized officially by her father, and if she had kind of grown up within the bosom of that family, and quite a bosom it is.
It is. So there's a major Alp in Alpenwald, and it appears to be
the one. They just have the one, Barbara. They only have the one mountain.
Exactly. But my point was, it's a rite of passage for the Alpenwalders, apparently, to climb this mountain, and they get a badge for. I was thinking about that when I got my second Pfizer shot, and they give you a little. I've been vaccinated, but we haven't gotten away from that.
See,
right?
it was an accomplishment.
Yeah,
you have to wear it around. Yeah, absolutely.
So there is a specific badge that people who have climbed the Alp in the Alpenwald managed to get, which I thought was great. But the other thing I thought was interesting is, what in the world did women wear to climb mountains when they had to be, you know, in basically Victorian dress? What did you decide that they were wearing?
Well, what I decided they were wearing is what they were actually wearing. I was inspired by two Victorian climbers in particular, Annie Smith Peck and Fanny Bullock Workman. They were extremely different women. Annie had to fight for every nickel she got to fund her expeditions. Fanny was wealthy and married. And they would race each other up mountains sometimes, and whoever got there first would plant her suffragist banner. Because they always seem to be competing for the same space. But one of the things that I learned, which was absolutely fascinating, is the very first woman to ever summit Mont Blanc was wearing a full skirt, a black feather boa, a velvet hat. I mean, the hamper of champagne. It was so over the top fabulous. I absolutely loved that. As the century wore on, and you get later into this golden age of mountaineering, more and more women were climbing. And what they decided to do was they would set off from their base camp or the village that they were in a skirt so that they looked respectable. Because mountaineering was not a hugely respectable occupation for a woman to engage in, because you had to be alone with men. It was physically very vigorous. But a lot of these women would take the skirt off once they got out of the sight of, the casual passerby, and they would figure out a place to stash it where they could grab it on the way back out. Now, they could go up that mountain, they could be up there for half a day, they could be freezing, they could be caught in storms, they could have run out of food, not even sure they're going to survive. But by God, they grabbed the skirt on the way back down and put it back on so that they would look respectable when they came back into town. And then they would just climb in trousers like men did for the hard parts of the climb. But they always had to have that veneer of respectability, which is just so ridiculous when you think about it.
Well, we were before bloomers and all that kind of
Mhm.
thing. So Tasha, why is Emily in Florence? I mean, sometimes Colin, once or twice, like in your Russian book, Emily had to do like a rear guard action in order to manage to get to St. Petersburg. But in this one, is Colin taking her along? Is he happy with all that? How did they manage to get to Florence?
Well, he is happy with it because he and his boss, shall we say, have orchestrated it. He needs to go to Florence for work, and he needs some cover, and the perfect cover for that is a holiday with his wife. But of course, he immediately asks her to invite her friend Cecile, a Parisian of a certain age who's violently elegant. And that tells Emily that there's more going on than Colin is letting on. But she's used to if you're, as we were saying before, if you're married to someone who is involved in covert work, you're going to have to come to terms with the fact that you can't know everything. Now, for someone like Emily, this does not mean that she is going to sit by quietly and let him do his thing without her doing her thing. And so they are ostensibly going on holiday in Florence, staying at Colin's daughter's palazzo, which is in a wonderful location in the city. But she knows that something is up. So she hasn't had to machinate her way in to the investigation in the same way that maybe sometimes she has to, because she has been willingly brought along by him.
So you have a wonderful time taking them to other countries. I mean, we've been in France, we've been in Vienna, we've been somewhere in Greece, we've been in Pompeii. So currently you have a fondness for Italy. And now we're in Florence. Were these destinations that most well-traveled English people would normally go to?
Absolutely. They really, well, other than Santorini in Greece. I mean, if you were doing your grand tour, you would go to Greece, but you might not necessarily go to Santorini. But Florence certainly was one of the prime destinations for any English traveler on a grand tour. This is where you get, room with a view. You get the whole notion of Florence being this overwhelming place. There are all kinds of British travelers who write about getting to Florence and being overcome with emotion on seeing the city, on being in the Uffizi Gallery, on gazing on all this wonderful art, that they're just overwhelmed by the city. And it's really kind of a funny thing, because I know for me, I had never been to Florence before I was sending Emily to Florence. And I got to Florence and I was by myself. Andrew was meeting me a few days later. And I arrive in Florence, and I had rented an apartment, and I get there and I dump my stuff and I start walking around. And my first impression was, I thought, yeah, this is definitely a city built by bankers. There's something very, it is the city of the Medici, right? It's architecture. If you think about Venice is this city that is impossibly beautiful. It's insane. It shouldn't exist. They've pounded logs into the lagoon floor so that they can build these palaces in the water, basically. They have marble gutters that weigh so much that it is a serious risk in terms of the buildings actually sinking into the sea. Florence is nothing like this. Florence is very staid. Florence is more like at first glance, she's not the stodgy sister because she's not stodgy, but she does not grab you and shake you and say, my God, I'm so beautiful, you must pay attention to me. It's the more of an understated elegance and beauty in Florence. You get the color of the stone, and the Florentines were very, very proud of their city. And, one of the things that they talk about a lot in the Renaissance is that the buildings are built from stone that is quarried from within the original city walls. They're taking the silt out of the Arno and using it to make the mortar. They're so city proud, but they're not flamboyant in the way that say Venice is. It's a very, very different kind of city.
Yeah, but both cities are so permeated with art, with fabulous art. Venice really more painting and some remarkable architecture, but Florence, we think, to this day, it's painting, but it's also sculpture and, all kinds of amazing things, and also great food. So that part is always exciting. But my memory of Florence, and I still actually have a pair of them, is that it became a glove making capital. And they had a terrific history of working leather and making fabulous gloves. And, so much of the Renaissance and all was all about clothes, about fashion. In fact, it's amazing how fashion determined lots of economics and, lots of fortunes. I remember when Rob and I sailed down the Columbia, we got to Astoria. And Rob, my husband, who grew up on Park Avenue, said to me, "Why is it called Astoria?" I was just like, "Really? You're asking me why it's called Astoria?" I was just like, whoa. But, the fur trade built, one major fortune here in America. And, you think about ostrich feathers and what happened, whatever fashion trends drive so much. And Florence, I've always thought, was like under the Medici and all, just a place where people like Elizabethan England, fashion was so much a part of what they did. So Emily likes clothes. So, is she touring fashion or art galleries while she's in Florence with Colin?
She's really kind of doing more with the art than the clothes, but the clothes really in the Renaissance in particular, this is how families showed their wealth. This is how families showed their power, because you didn't have access to these kinds of fabrics, the silks, the leather, there were dyes that were only used for wealthy families. You could get arrested if you were not of the right class and wearing fabric dyed with certain dyes. And in fact, in the Renaissance, you would have a wedding procession when a couple got married. And of course, this was beyond the sort of Victorian arranged marriage. This is a political alliance between families. And if you look at Florence in the Renaissance, if we think about Romeo and Juliet, where you have the Capulets and the Montagues fighting on the street and literally killing each other. This is what Florence was like at the beginning, in the early stages of the Renaissance, late Middle Ages, early Renaissance. You had gangs of young men, primarily based on their families, who just went around fighting each other and killing each other. And in Florence, there came a point where the merchants, because you remember Florence, like I said, this is a banker's city, right? This is a town built by merchants who trade, and banking especially become the most important things for not just their personal fortunes, but for the city's fortunes. And the merchants in Florence eventually get to a point late in the Middle Ages, early Renaissance, where they go to the town government, the city government, because they're a republic. Florence is a republic. And they say, if we don't do something about these gangs, all of our businesses are going to fail, because no one can go through the city, because you have these marauding gangs of basically unruly teenage boys who are killing each other. And it's really bad for business. So the government actually squashed these gangs and put all these laws in place that made it so that the individual families no longer had so much political power. And I mean, they still had political power, but they couldn't go around killing each other so that the merchants could go about conducting business. But what you get after that then is that the same families are still powerful families, of course, and they still have the most money. But when they arrange marriages, these are political, these are business oriented marriages, and there is an actual wedding procession leaving from one palazzo going to, because in the Renaissance, you actually didn't, in Italy, you didn't get married in the church. You just, the wedding ceremony was kind of just a thing in your house. But there would be this procession where they literally carried the bride's trousseau through the streets of Florence. So she is going to be dressed in this unbelievable gown. She's going to have a parade of chests behind her that are decorated. That was the thing that Botticelli did. He decorated the chests that would hold the trousseau to be paraded through the streets. And these young women who, we think about the rough road that women have in Victorian England, and how women, say in Pericles' Athens, didn't have a great voice in society. I would say that probably the women in Renaissance Florence, they probably had it the worst of any women that I have studied through my entire career. They weren't even supposed to look out of windows because a man might see you looking out the window. And isn't that trashy? When now you've been trashy looking out the window. So by the way, now your family, you're trashy, your whole family, so they couldn't even look out a window. And this is pre-Savonarola, who makes it even crazier. But they get to pick the artist that decorates the chests that their trousseaus are in. And Botticelli was one of the favorites. And so you get this sort of interesting that these women have really, really got no public role. They barely even have a role in their family, honestly. I mean, they manage the household, but they, you think about Victorian women who are the power behind their political husbands. These women were not that. They are living in a much more restricted lifestyle, but they still are really engaged with the art in Florence, which is so, so important culturally to them, but also to us. I mean, we think about Florence, we think about Michelangelo, and we think about Botticelli, and we think about the Duomo, and how did someone build a cathedral with a dome that big when they didn't even know how it could be done at the time that Bruno Skelly is getting the commission to build the Duomo. He has no idea how to do it, but he's like, I'll figure it out. But so somehow in the midst of all this, that culture and that art is getting to the women somehow, as we see from the chests that their trousseaus are in.
Well, there was, that's all background, because what we really have in this book is Colin as a secret agent taking Emily and her friend along as kind of a screen, and they check into this beautiful palazzo, and astonishingly, somebody dies. So it goes on from there. Veronica, you also, Deanna. I love that. So we haven't really talked about what happens, but we have got Veronica and Stoker, and an exhibit is being arranged. Do I have that right? A woman has died falling off the Alp in the Alpenwald.
Yes, my Victorian mountaineer, Alice Baker Green, has fallen off a mountain, and Veronica and Stoker are tasked with putting together the memorial exhibit,
right,
at the Curiosity Club, because that's what they do when one of the members dies, is they kind of have a whole an exhibit devoted to their lives, their accomplishments. And a lot of her things have been chipped over because she was staying in the Alpenwald while she engaged in this last expedition. She'd been climbing there a lot. And so they're the ones who have to put everything together. And it's Stoker who realizes from looking at her climbing equipment, things are not okay. Things are not copacetic. A murder has happened. And so they end up getting involved in that regard. And so there are some, there's a lot of herring around London and you know, a little light breaking and entering, as you do, and a few other diplomatic engagements. We get to take them to the opera, which I love to do from time to time. So, and I got to create my own opera, which is always fun too. So, you know, I got to make my own country, make my own opera. There's, I mean, there's a lot to love when you get to just conjure these things entirely out of nowhere and play God a little bit. And I mean, I got to do the flora and fauna of this country. I got to do the folklore. I got to make up the animals that live there, their patron saint, who has an otter. So they have otters rampant on their coat of arms. Yeah, so I had a lot of fun playing with this book.
Well, I can certainly see that. And then you bring a royal visit to London, and Stoker and Veronica are then involved in the Alpenwald royal family, which is where we come back to the prisoner's end of it. I don't want to spoil anything. So we probably should leave
Yes,
it
we
at
do.
there.
Yes, we do. We do.
It's really a lot of fun. You don't take them. I mean, they have been off on the island. And that was a wonderful book, sort of Rebecca-ish book and whatever, but you haven't really taken them well out of England on some kind of expedition. Although Veronica is so well traveled because she's been around the world. How many times does she say?
Oh, I think around the world completely at least 3 times by the time she's 25. Yeah, she was in Java when Krakatoa erupted. She's been there's a little I have a for people who pre-ordered the book, there's a portal you can go into on the internet that has some exclusive Veronica material, and there's a diary entry of when she was in Costa Rica. She's been all kinds of places, but it's a running joke throughout the books that all she wants to do is get back out there, and every time the poor girl packs a carpet bag and grabs her butterfly net, something happens, and she keeps being stuck in London, you know, with these fogs and the gaslit streets, and trying to kind of, it's the first time she's ever lived in London. And she's been there for 2 years now, and she's kind of adapting to life in the metropolis. But yeah, it's an ongoing joke at this point, because Stoker is very much the same way. You know,
Right.
he led an expedition to the Amazon. He was a surgeon's mate in the Royal Navy. So he went around the world on you know, the HMS Luna, and was involved in the bombardment of Alexandria, and all kinds of good things. So he's had his share of travels. She's had hers, and yet they just keep getting stuck in London. And every once in a while, like you said, they had an island off the coast of Cornwall for an adventure. And the one I'm writing now, they actually do get out of London. they do get out of London for a little while. But we'll see if they get further afield one of these days. Veronica, in a little kind of interregnum period between 2 of the books, Veronica has made a quick visit to Madeira and back, which is a very good place to butterfly. But she also had an ulterior motive for going there. So
Yes, she did.
she's gotten one little trip since we've known Veronica. Bless her. I feel like she's getting a little cabin fever.
Another time, because I think we've used up our time talking about other stuff. I would love to know how you've learned so much about taxidermy, because, you know, Stoker, obviously, this is his passion.
Oh, you should see my library.
You actually
I've
done it
amassed
yourself?
a lot of books.
Have
Yes.
you tried your hand at actual taxidermy?
No, I'm terrified. I'm terrified to actually try it. But I do have actually, hang on, I want to show you something.
Okay.
A few months ago, I had a reader contact me, and she is by trade a mouse taxidermist. And she made a Veronica Speedwell mouse. She
Fabulous.
even has a little butterfly in her. She has a knife in her belt. She has a little tiny flask, just like Veronica always carries. And she's got little daggers in the back of her helmet for suitors who prove a little too overbearing. So I have a piece of I would be terrified. Now, she goes to great pains to tell people the mice come from the local raptor rehabilitation center. So they have been used as food, and all they do is send her the skins. So the mice have gone to feed birds of prey that are being rehabilitated. So she's getting something that would have just otherwise been thrown away and making art out of it. And so I have a Veronica Speedwell taxidermy mouse now.
Fabulous. I love it. So, no open wall beds, but
It's very intricate. It really is. Yeah, and she actually made, because Veronica carries a little gray velvet mouse wherever she goes. It was a little token given to her by her father, unbeknownst to her, for a couple of books. There is a little teeny tiny gray mouse tucked in Veronica Mouse's bag. So this artist hit all the notes. She didn't miss a trick.
Well, the Victorians had a huge interest in natural sciences along with the Industrial Revolution that was going on. And so I can certainly see why lepidoptery and taxidermy, would be important to them. There were big collections of that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Let me summon up Patrick from the Dark Well. Patrick, do rejoin us and see if there are questions or comments you'd like to forward.
I am here. Yes, there are actually. That mouse is terrifying, by the way.
She's adorable, Patrick. Do not diss my mouse.
Okay, our friend Lisa Holstein asks, so this is for Deanna. She says, I love Veronica and Stoker, but I want to hear more about the book with the 4 female assassins.
So that is the book that is in, I have 2 books that I'm currently writing right now. One of them is Veronica 7, and one is my first contemporary, which is about 4 60-something female assassins who have to band together to take out the organization that has employed them. And that one is looking to come out late summer of 22. And that's all you get, Lisa. That's all you get. That's all I'm allowed to say at this point.
Let's see. Margaret asks, love both these series. She says, I'm curious how many Veronica Speedwell books Deanna has plans for. Do you have an end game?
As many as they'll let me write. I'm like I said, I'm doing 7 now, and there's scope to do a couple dozen more if they let me and if I want to. And so yeah, as long as we can do this, then we'll be doing it, because I love writing these characters. They're great fun.
Here's a question for Tasha. Margaret, she says, what was the inspiration for Colin's daughter appearing at this time in the series? And will she and Emily's relationship develop further? I expected more tension in the previous book because Emily's difficulty with Christiana, I'm sorry, I'm misreading that, and how hard it was for her to overcome that.
Well, actually, it's funny, Deanna, you were saying about how you look back at what you've written before and all this stuff is there. And when I wrote the 3rd book in the series, A Fatal Waltz, which is set in Vienna, and where Emily encounters Colin's former mistress, who in fact is his daughter's mother, that I was kind of going back and just revisiting things in the series when I was deciding what to write next. And I was just struck by, wait a minute, how, as we were talking about birth control a little while ago, if Colin had this extremely passionate affair for many years with this woman, it's not unreasonable to think that there would be a child. And, Christiana, Kat's mother, the daughter, she was a spy too. And she did not want Colin, who she did love, to be in danger. And if you're a spy, if you're an asset like that, any tie that you have makes you vulnerable. So when I was thinking about this, I thought, Christiana absolutely would have hidden the child. And only when she's an adult is she going to find out who her father is. And so it was really just a question of timing. I was taking the number of years from when she would have been born, and I guess the Pompeii book was 1903, and that was putting Kat at the right kind of age that she would have been informed by the solicitor who her father was and would have gone off looking for him. And so that is why she appeared then, because earlier than that, she wouldn't have been old enough.
It's interesting.
And Emily is not happy about it.
I was just
But
gonna
you know,
say-
if your husband has a kid, what are you gonna do? He has the kid's there, right? You can't make her go away.
All right, let's see. Well, here's a good question for Deanna. Do Veronica and Stoker ever hook up? What's going on here?
Okay, now if you guys have seen any of my events, you know I never ever ever give out spoilers. But yeah, of course. Yes, of course. This is where we were leading. Yes, this is a thing that has happened. But it has happened prior to this book. So yeah, they have certainly kind of crossed that particular threshold. Now, what that means for them is that it's a very interesting complication at this stage, because we have two people who have been. It's not so much that they have baggage; it's that they have giant steamer trunks of baggage that they both haul around. They both are commitment phobic at this point. And so seeing how that vulnerability affects each of them individually. And remember too, Veronica is not a romantic person. Stoker is the one who reads French novels, you know, for the romances. He loves his new French romances when they show up in the post, and he's very sentimental. And he carries around, you know, his big red pocket handkerchiefs and his tins of sweets. So he's our sentimental character. So how will his prior wounds interact with his, you know, tendency to want to be a soft and smooshy kind of person? That remains to be seen.
It would be worthwhile mentioning that everybody has previous romantic history. Emily's a widow, and Colin, we now know, has a mistress and a child. So, you know, they were not like a virgin couple at 18. And, you know, Veronica has obviously had a fairly active love life.
A life.
Yeah. And, you know, and Stoker is married. In fact, that's been one of the drivers in the series.
Stoker is a divorced fellow. Yes, he is.
Yes, is an unfortunate choice. And then interestingly, both of you have chosen to have characters who are illegitimate, you know, were born illegitimate, whatever, which puts them on the outside of society in some respects. So I think
it's very liberating, because when you have a character who's not absolutely expected to do, you know, just by virtue of their birth, there are certain things that they're going to be restricted from. There are certain places where they're not going to be welcome. There are certain expectations they will never be able to meet. I can see where if you have a character who is strong enough and self-actualized enough that they will look at those limitations and say, fine, you don't want me, I don't need to be there. I don't need to be part of this world, and kind of take that as license to push their behavior wherever they like, because they've already been told you're not going to measure up to this standard. So, okay, fine, throw the standard out. I won't measure up to any of your standards. It's liberating when you're writing them, because you can let them do things that ordinarily Victorian people might be inclined to, you know, to behave, and you can let your characters not behave, which is a lot more fun.
Sounds very contemporary, actually. In a lot
and
of
yet
ways.
very of the period.
No, the bar sinister is very liberating. But part of the reason I wanted to bring Kat in, as I mean, yeah, she's illegitimate, but she's also not part of British society, so she doesn't really care what they think, except that it might annoy Emily, which she likes that. But I wanted to also bring her in because, you know, Emily and Colin are quite radical for Victorians, but we're in 1903 now. We're Edwardian, and Kat looks at them, and they, to her, will always be these stodgy Victorians. Even though they're radical for their time, she is going to push those boundaries even further because she's Edwardian. She's coming of age in a completely different era from when Emily did.
I have a question from Jamie, and she asks for Tasha, how old was Emily at the start of the series? Now that I know 10 plus years have passed since the series began, I imagine she must have been even younger than I expected when Philip died.
Yeah, I always, when I started writing, I took some very sage advice from Elizabeth Peters, who said that she had always regretted saying how old Amelia was in the first book because it really tied her up. So I've never said how old Emily is in And Only to Deceive, but she's young. So so you can kind of figure, if she got married at the kind of time that, if she's coming out of mourning in 1890, she's maybe 20. She's not very old. But it's all very relative. I remember I was at an event once, and some wonderful, wonderful readers asked me how old Cecile was, because they said, well, Cecile, Emily's dear friend, is a woman of a certain age. And so they said to me, so is she like 30? And so, when you're 20, 30 seems like a certain age. When you're 40, 60 seems like a certain age. So age is such a weird relative thing. So Emily is probably younger than you thought at the beginning, but I'll never go on the record as saying exactly how old she is, because I always think of Amelia and Emerson climbing the pyramids, right? And you do the math and you're like, they're like 75 now. But I always picture Amelia and Emerson as like 40. So to me, I don't care how old they're supposed to be, they will always be 40.
Well, she even had to make a point of the fact that Amelia was dyeing her hair at one point to keep it black, because you do the math and she's gray.
Barbara, didn't you have a great story about Barbara Mertz? Wasn't that her real name, Barbara Mertz? Mm-hmm. And how she stopped flying when they wouldn't allow her to smoke on the plane anymore? Is that true?
Yeah, she and my husband, the contrarian, had a great relationship. We had many encounters with Barbara. Went to visit her a couple of times in her home. And I have to tell you that her beautiful bathroom in the upstairs part of her house was all painted as an Egyptian scene with gorgeous lotus flowers and all this other stuff. I asked her if I could take a photo of it, because I didn't want, it's a personal space you don't really want to invade. But she was fabulous. And in fact, Deanna, I asked you that question about contraception because she and I discussed that one time, because the Victorian Egyptian explorer, the female that she modeled Amelia on was
Amelia Edwards.
And then there was another one, but I said to her, how did these women go off on these long expeditions, around Egypt and so forth, and not have to deal with childbirth? And she said, well, the only real way to do it was abstinence. Everything else
was the only foolproof way, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's always sort of stuck in my mind. She was a fabulous person. I'm so happy to have gotten to know her for as long. And when Dana and I went to Egypt a year ago, December, to research one of Dana's books, and I was sort of along for the ride, we each took our 2 Amelia Peabody books with us, along with Death on the Nile. That was our required for the trip. And you know what? Those books really hold up. And one of the great things about historical fiction is it doesn't date. You always have to, other books, we've had so many conversations over the course of 31 years about authors and dating, age problems, just is it a real, in real time, are we aging every year, and all kinds of things. But the great thing about historical fiction, it's already aged. So, you can have them like a month between events. It doesn't really matter. The pandemic, a big question that comes up in these conversations, you don't have to write about the pandemic. You could write about cholera in London or something.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of advantages to writing it, but also think it's very comforting to read historical fiction at difficult times, because you know what happened. And the thing is,
absolutely,
because you don't know what's happening. It's so hard to live in this kind of constant anxiety, but in historical fiction, it's already happened. So it's much more.
I think there's a sort of comfortable exoticism to historical fiction. It's just different enough to make it feel like a real escape, but there are familiar elements enough that you can identify and you can relate. And so when you get good resolution.
1903 is not 1503, so your books are both more contemporary.
Well, that was one thing with the Florence book. The Renaissance chapters of the book in the 15th century in Florence, you had the Black Death coming back at least once a decade. And, think about how we're dealing with COVID. Imagine if for like the next 100 years, we had a pandemic that, once a decade came in and killed half the population. I mean, that's a lot to deal with.
Patrick, anything else?
Yeah, a couple of people have asked, Deanna, do you have any more Julia Gray books planned?
Yeah. No, not planned. I left my previous publisher when they declined to publish anymore, and we got done with the 1920s books. And new publishers like new stories, and so that's how Veronica got started. So there are no plans, no firm plans. Never say never. Publishing is such an odd business that my mother swears that the mantra should be expect the unexpected, because you just never know. So there's no firm plan for more Julia at this point. But like I said, I would never rule anything out completely. So
good.
Let's see. Jordan asks, Tasha, you have Emily going to Egypt next, but is there another ideal location you would take her?
Okay, Jordan, I hope that's you, Jordan. Jordan and I rendezvoused both in Pompeii and in Florence. So Emily has always wanted to go to Egypt. I would say, I'm tossing around ideas, but I've always wanted her in a Scottish castle someday.
Cool. Let's see. This is funny. Janet has a question for Barbara. She says, for Ms. Peters, is that a Beatles glass you're sipping from?
No, it's actually a hand-painted wine goblet that my husband's cousin gave us as a wedding present. And it's so classy. I use it as my bathroom glass, but I also like it on Zoom because regular wine glass is so transparent, but it's got gorgeous colors in it. So
I wonder where they got Beatles out of that. I'm not sure.
I don't, it's not Beatles. It's actually just Picasso-esque, actually. Yeah, right.
Let's see, anything else here?
Well, why don't I do a reminder while you're looking that we do have autographed copies of The Dark Heart of Florence, and what is it called? A perilous, sorry, I don't.
We are at an unexpected peril.
Thank you. I knew peril was part of the book.
Here's a question. Yeah, I put links to both books in the comments field.
Oh, thank you.
And yeah, for Deanna, Margaret asks, I'm kind of paraphrasing a little bit. She appreciated the nod to Jane Eyre. There's a quote, "Reader, I carried him."
Oh yeah.
She says, do you have any other fun nods to other literary classics in your books?
Nothing that is that specific. That moment presented itself, and it's a moment where they're in a burning building and Stoker is he's been knocked unconscious, and the only way they can get out is for Veronica to physically remove him herself. And the idea of writing the line, "Reader, I carried him," was just, there was no way I was going to let that go past. And that's the line that gets Jane Eyre lovers. That's what I hear from, because they know it instantly. There are always homages in my books to things that I have loved. Barbara and I were talking about this earlier. Anything that was formative for me. So if you have read those books, you will probably be aware of them. The one that was set off the coast of Cornwall on an island, A Dangerous Collaboration. That's because of the fact that I grew up loving Du Maurier and the very early Victoria Holts that were always, set on some stately manor on a crumbling coast of Cornwall. So there's always going to be an Easter egg somewhere. You just have to know to look for it.
I'm so glad you mentioned Victoria Holt. I read every book she ever wrote. She also wrote as Philippa Gregory, if I remember right. Wasn't that her 16th?
Philippa Carr was her,
Philippa,
when she wrote her historical fiction, her saga, her family saga. And then Jean Plaidy, when she was doing her Queens of England.
The Queens of England, right. Yeah, the Philippa ones were the 17th century. But I just loved her as Victoria Holt. I always thought, she was an amazing person. Talk about another person with pseudonyms. And she died at sea. And, you
She
know,
did at
and-
90. And I'm
Yep.
thinking, what a glorious
still
way to go.
writing, died at sea and was slipped overboard. And I thought, perfect. I just
And I
love
keep
that.
hoping she had a wonderful tango with some gorgeous, 40-year-old
Yeah.
man the night before, or maybe it was coconut shrimp night. I don't know. But
Right.
I just hope she had a wonderful time before she
I
fell
do
slipped into
overboard,
bed
or
that night.
did she
Yeah.
fall overboard, or
No,
No,
she
she
died
died
under
and they
sea.
buried her at sea. You could still
Oh,
do
I
that
see.
when she died. No,
Yeah.
she died.
That's how my great grandfather was buried, at sea.
Yeah.
He died at the Rock of
You could do
Gibraltar.
that. But for people who love the kind of books we're talking about tonight, Victoria Holt, Mary Stuart, although
Oh,
Mary
yeah.
Stuart's were generally contemporary, but still, I mean, contemporary for her
For her
time.
time.
Yeah,
Sure.
Phyllis Whitney wrote, but she was more American. I think
Mhm.
Victoria Holt was. And then, Anya Seton wrote. I swear Catherine probably was my most formative reading experience at some point. I
Oh,
just really
absolutely.
fell in
And
love.
I latched onto it because my parents are madly into genealogy, and I found out she was a direct ancestor. And so, I read it like, oh, family history practically, because, it brought that character so much to life. And she
Yeah.
was such a phenomenal character. And-
Absolutely. She also makes the whole War of the Roses intelligible but anyway, Patrick, anything else? We've been keeping people here past the hour.
Not
Yeah.
really. No.
All right. Well, then I'd like to thank all of you who've been watching for your questions and your attention and theoretically your book purchases. Tasha and Deanna, absolutely wonderful to see you. I wish it were in person, but this has been a lovely way to connect. So,
Oh, so good to see you too. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Patrick, for the tech help. And thank you, Barbara. Good to see you, Tasha.
Tasha, you too. Love to Andrew because I just saw him, but it's always good to see you too. Good night, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.